Hello everyone. Tonight we are gathered in a clearing, in the heart of an enchanted forest, and we have many stories to listen to and things to discover. So without further ado, let's begin with the first story, one from Ireland that was put in writing in the Middle Ages, but appeared centuries earlier. The story of Deirdre of the Sorrows. Once upon a time, a king ruled over Ulster. His name was Cruthur MacNessa, Cruthur son of Ness. And at his court, Awen Macha, lived the royal storyteller, the royal bard, Fermid MacDowell. One day, Fermid had a daughter, Deirdre, and as usual for newborns, prophecies were made. The chief druid prophesied that Deirdre would grow up to be a very beautiful woman, one whose charm would be almost irresistible, but that much blood would be shed because of her. Kings and lords would go to war, and the greatest warriors of Ulster would be forced into exile for her sake. The prophecy terrified the court, and many urged Fermid the bard to kill the baby before it became a reality. Fermid didn't know what to do, but the king chose for him. The announcement that Deirdre would be one of the most desirable women in the world had aroused him. So he decided to keep the child for himself. He would let her grow up and marry her later when she would be of age. Cruthur the king, guided by lust, hid Deirdre. The infant was entrusted to a poet, a wise woman who lived in seclusion in the woodlands and never received any visitors. Her name was Lugh. Away from the court and society, only in the company of Lugh, Deirdre grew up happily, and the first part of the prophecy seemed to become reality. As years passed, she turned into a beautiful child, and then a delicate and irresistible young woman. One day in the winter, as an immaculate blanket of snow covered the forest, Deirdre saw a raven landing in the snow with its prey, and was ravished by the colors. She told Lugh that one day she would love a man with the same colors she had seen: hair as dark as the raven, skin as white as snow, and cheeks as red as blood. Lugh had become very attached to Deirdre, that she now regarded as her daughter, after all these years, when the joy and affection of the girl had softened her lonely existence. So she told Deirdre that the man she described existed. She was describing Naoise, a handsome young hunter, warrior, and singer, who lived at Awen Macha at the court of King Cruthur. Disobeying the orders of the king, the old woman helped her young protégé to meet the man of her dreams. As soon as Deirdre and Naoise met, they fell in love, and realized that life would be meaningless if they couldn't spend it together. Naoise could count on his two brothers. Together they were the three greatest warriors of Ulster. And together they made plans to escape the country and travel to Scotland, where Naoise and Deirdre would be able to live together far from the reach of King Cruthur. And so it was done. The four escaped on a boat and soon reached Scotland. They lived a happy life there. They fished and hunted to eat. They saw magnificent places. And this simple life was enough to fulfill their dreams of happiness, because love and the joy of being together nourished them every minute of every hour of every day. They didn't think about it, but the prophecy had said, when Deirdre was born, that the greatest warriors of Ulster would be forced into exile, and so it had happened. Back at the court of Ulster, the king had been humiliated, and his fury did not diminish. So he resolved to take revenge and get back the woman he had decided would be his. He sent a loyal courtier with an invitation to return for the three brothers and Deirdre, and a promise of safe return home. The brothers had not forgotten their sense of duty, despite their exile to Scotland, and they accepted the offer, confident that the king would not dare make prisoner or harm people he had invited personally. How wrong they were, because Cruthur's anger had made him forget honesty and the laws of hospitality. As the news of their return reached Ulster, the king sent Loerham, the old woman who had raised Deirdre, spy on the travellers, with the mission to tell him whether Deirdre's beauty was still intact. The woman tried to protect Deirdre, and came back reporting that her protégée had aged and was now ugly. But it was a lie. Deirdre's beauty had only bloomed during her stay in Scotland, and the king knew it, because he didn't trust the old woman and had sent another spy to check on her. Deirdre, Naoise, and his two brothers were lodging at a house that the king sent his soldiers to attack, with orders to bring Deirdre back alive. The following day, as the king's troops attacked their refuge, the three brothers fought with all their strength, and many of their enemies died. The prophecy had announced that much blood would be shed because of Deirdre, and much blood was shed this day, even though it was lust and anger from the king that were responsible. Despite their bravery and their strength, Naoise and his brothers could not contain an entire army, and they ended overwhelmed. Naoise was killed by a spear, and his brothers shortly after him. After the death of Naoise and the capture of Deirdre, Cruthur took her as his wife. Deirdre's body was still alive, but something was dead inside her. Something had died with her only love. Silent and sad, she let each day pass without noticing the heat or the cold, the joy or the sadness of others around her, and weeks made of days that felt all the same, passed. Then months, made of weeks that felt all the same too. After a year, Cahul could no longer bear Deirdre's coldness and contempt that reminded him every day of what he had done and prevented him from enjoying the company of his wife. All the more that sorrow only enhanced her beauty and made her more attractive than ever. He asked her who she hated the most in the world besides him, and she said it was the man who had killed Naoise with his spear. Cahul replied that he would then give her to this man, so that he would be freed from her, and she would pay the price of her coldness. As she was being taken to her future spouse on a chariot, the king taunted her. This was more than she could bear, and so she threw herself from the chariot against a rock, finally finding deliverance through death. Deirdre was no more. The curse of her beauty was finally accomplished. I told you earlier that this story is from Ireland. It is taken from the Ulster Cycle, one of several cycles of Irish heroic legends. There are 4 main ones, and the Ulster Cycle alone comprises 80 different stories. And Irish mythology is only one aspect of Celtic mythology. There was a time when Celtic peoples covered a large part of Europe, from Eastern Europe to Spain and Great Britain and Ireland. So who were the Celts? What happened to them? What did they believe in? What gods? What myths? How did this heritage reach us or get lost sometimes? These are some of the topics we will touch on tonight. And of course there will be many more stories from the mythology of Celtic nations, where this cultural heritage lasted longer and had much influence. In Scotland, Ireland, Wales, parts of England like Cornwall, Britanny in the west of France. We have a lot of things to discuss, so I suggest you make yourself comfortable. As always, you can follow the story just by listening. If you decide to close your eyes, your imagination will work for you and help take you away from the worries, concerns and thoughts that keep you awake. So allow yourself a moment of escapism and discovery in the Celtic forests of the past. If you fall asleep, you will be able to resume the story where you left it, using the timestamps in the first comment. In the same comment, which is pinned, you will find links to listen to my stories on audio streaming services, if this is more convenient for you. This story will be available soon, and the last one about Egyptian mythology is already uploaded. And also a link to my Patreon page if you feel inspired to support me there. You are now more than 500 patrons funding this channel, so that it remains free of video ads for everyone. And if you become a patron, you can download the stories as audios or videos, listen to them as podcasts, participate in surveys to choose future topics, and get information regularly about what comes next on my channel. But now is story time. So let's return to our topic and more Celtic stories. So what is Celtic mythology? It is almost as if there were several, because the religions and beliefs of the Celts were not unified, and in some regions they lasted much longer than in others. The golden age of the Celts across Europe was during the Iron Age in the first millennium BC. The Celts were a collection of peoples with languages that were apparented, and many common cultural traits. They descended from migrants that had arrived centuries earlier from the east. They were one of these numerous waves of Indo-European peoples that are believed to have spread from Ukraine and the north of the Caucasus to all of Europe and as far south as Persia and India. The cradle of their specific European culture, at least the most ancient parts of it that archaeology has revealed, was in a large region that went through the east of France, the south of Germany, Austria and Hungary. But over several centuries they expanded as far east as Romania and even the center of Anatolia in modern Turkey, and as far west as Spain, Portugal, Great Britain and Ireland. In the first centuries of Rome, the Roman Republic was under a serious threat from the Celts installed in the north of Italy. But after a peak by the middle of the first millennium BC, the cultural area of the Celts began to shrink. They were faced with two main competitors for space. From the east came another Indo-European group, Germanic peoples, who progressively advanced towards the west, reaching the Rhine River and Scandinavia. In all the previously Celt regions east of the Rhine, Celtic culture was replaced with Germanic culture. And the second threat came from the south. The expansion of Rome to Spain, France, Belgium, Great Britain also shrank considerably the regions dominated by Celtic peoples. They stayed where their ancestors had lived for generations, but their culture did not always resist the might of Rome. Beside its military and economic might, Rome was also a cultural power that transformed the societies it conquered. So, about 2,000 years ago, after the Germanic and the Roman wave of expansion, the areas where Celtic culture remained dominant were limited to the fringes of Europe or the margins of the Roman Empire. Scotland in the north of Great Britain, Wales that was occupied by the Romans, but where Romanization was not as intense as in England or in Spain, in Gaul. The language and many traditions survived 3 centuries of occupation. Some parts of England, like Cornwall, and Ireland, that remained free of Roman presence. The Celtic area re-expanded a bit later with the migration of Celtic Britons, especially to the south, to the region of Britanny, but we will return to that a bit later. speaking of Ireland, let's dive into another story from the Ulster Cycle for now. The story of Cú Chulainn, a legendary demigod, the son of Lugh, a god from the Tuatha Dé Danann. We will talk about it later too. And a mortal. His mother was Deirdre, the sister of the King of Ulster, Cú Chulainn, that we have just seen as the villain in the story of Deirdre. The life of Cú Chulainn was filled with extraordinary deeds and miracles, starting with his birth. There are several versions of it, but here is one. His mother, Deirdre, was the sister of the King of Ulster, and one day she accompanied him and a group of nobles to hunt a flock of magical birds. But snow began to fall, and they had to look for shelter. They found a house nearby, where only a couple lived, and the woman was pregnant, about to give birth. On the night of their arrival, she gave birth, and Deirdre assisted in the birth. It was a baby boy. In the barn near the house, a mare also gave birth to twin colts. The Ulster men camped around the house that could not accommodate them all. But on the next morning, when everyone woke up, the house and the barn had disappeared, and their occupants were nowhere to be found. Only the child and the colts remained. This was obviously magic at work. Maybe a divine intervention, and the boy could not be abandoned. So Deirdre took him home and began raising him as her own. But the boy fell ill shortly after, and he died. As Deirdre was mourning the child, the god Lugh appeared to her and revealed that he was their host that night. He had seen how she had started raising the child and decided that she should be the mother of his son. He also told her that he had already placed his child in her womb, and that she should call him Setanta when he would be born. Then Lugh disappeared, leaving Deirdre to her dismay. Months passed, and the belly of Deirdre betrayed her pregnancy more and more each day, which turned into a scandal, as she was promised, but not yet married, to a warrior of the court. Deirdre explained herself, revealing the nature of the child she was carrying, and the entire court of Ulster, Awinmacha, was filled with wonder. When Deirdre gave birth to the child, he was named Setanta, as ordered by Lugh, and the nobles of Ulster argued for the honor of being his foster father. The dispute was settled by deciding that several of them would be foster parents, so that the miraculous child would be the son of the entire Awinmacha. The king himself and several other noblemen and women who would teach him judgment, eloquent speech, morals, poetry and arts, provide for him and nurse him until he would become the extraordinary hero he was promised to be. Several years passed, and Setanta grew up. He became a healthy and brave child. There was a group of children at Awin Macha, a boy troop that played and trained together. And even though he was still a small child, Setanta begged his foster parents to join them. But he didn't know that the custom was for newcomers to ask for the boy's protection before joining the group. And he ran onto the playing field without asking. The boys took this as a challenge and attacked him. He seemed to stand no chance against a dozen boys older than him. But as they started fighting, he suddenly had a battle frenzy and beat them all single-handedly. King Crahur arrived and put a stop to the fight. He cleared the misunderstanding, and Setanta accepted to ask for the boy's protection. Not that he needed it, apparently. But as soon as he got it, he began to chase after them, demanding they all put themselves under his protection, revealing that not only was he an extraordinary fighter, he also had innate authority and leadership. Crahur had noted the boy's exploits and kept an appreciative and protecting eye on him. It happened one day that a smith called Cullen invited the king to a feast at his house. Before going, the king went to the playing field, where the boys were playing the traditional game of hurling. He was so impressed by Setanta's performance on the field that he asked him to join him at the feast when the game would be over. Setanta agreed, and the king went to Cullen's house. But he forgot to tell his host that the boy would arrive later. And as all the guests had arrived, Cullen let loose his hound to protect the house. The hound was enormous and ferocious, so much so that the whole neighborhood was afraid of him and would never have approached the house when it was guarding it. But Setanta couldn't know this, and when he arrived at the house to join the feast as ordered by the king, the beast attacked him, a beast 3 times heavier than him, with powerful jaws and big teeth. A fight ensued, and Setanta had to kill the hound in self-defense. Everyone in the house was alarmed by the noise, and when they exited, they saw the dead hound and understood what had happened. Cullen was devastated by the loss of his hound, so Setanta promised he would find a replacement, and until the puppy would be old enough to do the job, he would guard Cullen's house himself. And so it was done. From this moment on, the Druids decided that Setanta's name would now be Cú Chulainn, Cullen's hound. In another episode of Cú Chulainn's childhood, it happened one day at Awin Macha that the young boy overheard the druid teaching his pupils. one of them had asked what that particular day was auspicious for, and the druid was now making a prophecy. He answered that any warrior who would take arms this day would accomplish such deeds that he would gain everlasting fame. Cú Chulainn was only 7, but the promise of everlasting fame and extraordinary accomplishments seduced him immediately. He went to the king and asked for arms. He was given several weapons, but none of them could withstand his strength, so that at the end, the king himself gave him his own weapons, which were the finest and strongest of Ulster, and they were perfect for Cú Chulainn. But as they were conversing, the druid arrived and grieved, because he had not finished his prophecy when Cú Chulainn had run to the king. The warrior who took arms that day would indeed be famous forever, but his life would be short, and so it became clear to all that Cú Chulainn would be a hero, but that his fate would probably be tragic. But the boy was still young, and not the kind to be discouraged by the sayings of an old man. Soon afterwards, upset by the way people kept talking about this prophecy at Awin Macha, he asked the king for a chariot. Time had come to accomplish great deeds. He set off on a foray and attacked 3 brothers, 3 warriors, enemies of the kingdom of Ulster, who used to boast that they had killed more Ulstermen than anyone else. He entered in one of his battle rages and easily defeated his enemies. But then he returned to Awin Macha, to the court of Ulster, still in this state of battle frenzy. He didn't know friends or foes when he was in this rage, and the Ulstermen were afraid that he would slaughter them all. By chance, the queen, who led the women at Awin Macha, had an idea. She ordered the women to bare their breasts to him. This unexpected but arousing display caught Cú Chulainn's eye, and he was distracted. The Ulstermen took the opportunity to wrestle him into a barrel of cold water. But the heat from his body was such that the barrel exploded in a cloud of steam. They put him in a second barrel, and this time the water only boiled, and then a third barrel, and this time the water only warmed to a pleasant temperature. The crisis was averted for now. Before we go on with the story of Cú Chulainn, let's take a look at the connection between Irish, Scottish or Welsh mythology with their Celtic roots, and why it is mainly through them that we have access to stories that were sometimes born more than 2,000 years ago. For the Celts in close contact with Rome, and where the empire stayed in place for longer, their myth and religion did not survive this period of several centuries. The ancient Celtic religion was abandoned, and the knowledge of the mythology from Spain or Gaul is known mainly through contemporary Roman and Christian sources, but there are very few. As I said before, only a few Celtic peoples maintained their linguistic identity and their political independence. The Gaels in Ireland and Scotland, the Welsh in Wales, and the Celtic Britons of southern England. Later, many Britons crossed the Channel to Britanny in the west of France and revived culture in Britanny against the general trend of weakening of Celtic culture. It is in these regions of Europe that Celtic culture and mythology lived on for several more centuries and left a much stronger trace. But the ancient Celtic religion was finally almost erased in the Middle Ages by Christianization. And paradoxically, some of these nations that adopted Christianity later than many other parts of Europe became intensely Christian. Ireland or Britanny became strongholds of Christianity in the Middle Ages. Celtic culture did not entirely disappear, of course. It remained in languages, in tales, in folklore, but the old religion was pretty much erased. Erased but not entirely forgotten, because the Middle Ages is the period when this agonizing ancestral mythology was put in writing, for a large part by monks, and a lot of precious information was preserved and transmitted this way. Centuries kept passing, and along the Middle Ages these nations generally maintained their independence. Scotland, Ireland, even though it was not unified, and Britanny. The exception politically being Wales, that was attached politically to England in the Middle Ages, but always kept the sense of its individuality. In the Renaissance and modern times, however, these small nations fell into the orbit of their bigger neighbors, and they lost their independence. Britanny was annexed by France in the 16th century. Scotland shared kings with England until the Acts of Union in 1707 that created a single kingdom of Great Britain. An Ireland that also was in a personal union with England since the 16th century, they had the same sovereign, joined Great Britain in 1801. These unions were always faced with local resistance from part of the population. But if you had asked a Scot, an Irishman, or a French citizen of Britanny what their identity was 200 years ago, they would never have said they were from a Celtic nation. The Celtic period was little known, almost entirely forgotten across the population, and it was not a meaningful political reference at the time. There was of course a sense of identity and difference based on the language, based on traditions, a long history of independence, but what people had in mind was history since the Middle Ages. The antiquity or the pre-Christian period was not important. It was little known, vaguely barbaric and pagan, so nothing to be proud of or build a respectable identity on in societies at the time that were still very Christian. The folklore, the tales that were told and passed from one generation to the next, very much alive and part of people's lives. They still contained a lot of Celtic pre-Christian elements, but these were not necessarily distinguished from later additions. And then came the 19th century and the Celtic revival, a renewed interest in national history that happened in pretty much all European countries. There was a Norse or Viking revival, a Germanic revival, and a Celtic revival. The curiosity of scholars and the public for pre-Christian and pre-Roman times increased dramatically. Archaeology, languages, myths and legends, it all became much more popular, and a part of the national identity in many European countries became linked to these ancestors and their culture, which was technically accurate, but also a choice because there were other possible ancestors from before. The Celts had the advantage of being better known. This was very important as a factor. And having lived long enough in these lands to be considered like the founding people, it was also very useful politically to create a sense of national unity, and the governments did not discourage and often promoted this way of telling a national history. This was when the French started to be taught in schools that their ancestors, for example, were the Gauls. So, regarding the Celtic aspect of these 19th century revivals, this is when the various nations or regions that consider themselves Celtic today began to adopt the term. A century earlier, they wouldn't have, and the Celtic revival changed their own perception of their history. It is a chosen identity, but one that makes sense, because indeed there is a major Celtic heritage that is not just based on DNA. The local languages, the folklore, the names of places, the historical roots of this sense of a national identity that distinguishes them from their neighbors. This all can be traced back to the Celtic period. Now, one difficulty when it comes to the sources of mythology is to distinguish what is from the original body of myth and religious beliefs that the ancient Celts had, and what has been added later by Roman or Christian authors who put mythology in writing. In popular culture, things can easily get mixed up. One example of this is the Celtic cross. This cross featuring a ring that unites its 4 branches. It is quite ancient. It appeared in the early Middle Ages in Ireland, Great Britain and France, but it appeared as a Christian symbol. There is no example of crosses like this made by the Celts before their conversion to Christianity. They used symbols like circles with branches that could possibly have inspired Celtic crosses, but all the high crosses that can be seen across Celtic regions date from the Middle Ages or after 1850 with the Celtic revival. And yet, many people believe that these crosses are ancient Celtic symbols. They can be called symbols of Celtic Christianity, but not of ancient Celtic paganism. The same for stone circles, the most famous being Stonehenge, but there are plenty across Western France, Great Britain, Spain or Ireland. Celt Druids may have used these circles, but they date from before the Celtic period. They are actually way older. I'll put a link in the description to the video about Stonehenge. So, even though details may have been changed, and time probably altered them, the stories that were written in the Middle Ages in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, parts of England, and Britanny are the closest things we have at our disposal to original Celtic myths. I told you earlier that the Ulster Cycle contained 80 different stories, but it is only a section of Irish mythology, one that centers on the north of Ireland. There is also the Fenian Cycle, or Finn Cycle, that centers on a hero called Finn MacCool and a group of his warriors, the Fionna. There is another set of tales about the Tuatha Dé Danann, the group of godlike peoples said to have arrived into Ireland in ancestral times. This one is called the mythological cycle. Yet another division is the cycles of the kings, that contain stories of legendary kings of Ireland. A lot of this Irish mythology is shared with Scotland, and actually in multiple stories characters travel between them. And apart from Ireland and Scotland, there are Welsh, Cornish and Breton mythology, which share stories or details with them, but are independent bodies in their own right that we won't have time to examine tonight, but I would be happy to make another video at some point about these specific mythologies. This abundance contrasts with continental Celtic mythology, apart from Britanny. This was entirely lost. From Gaul or Spain, we know close to nothing of the myths that were transmitted by the oral tradition, and pretty much all we have is the name of several gods that were worshipped either across the Celtic world or locally. So now let's take a look at what we know of these deities and the Celtic Pantheon. Among the gods and goddesses that transcended tribal boundaries and regions, there were a few notable ones. The Matres, Cernunnos, Taranis, the sky god, or Epona, the horse goddess. They were probably known under different names, depending on the regions, but traces of their cult have been found across the ancient Celtic world. The Matres were female deities, worshipped in northwestern Europe. They were always depicted in groups of 3. Their function is little known, but they had a large following that coexisted with the Roman gods during the first centuries in Gaul or northern Italy. Interestingly, this motif of tribal goddesses was very widespread in ancient Europe. The Romans had the Parcae, the female personifications of destiny. The Greeks had the 3 Fates. The Norse had the Norns, always going by 3. In Irish mythology there is the Morrigan. We will talk about this tribal goddess later. It is believed that this tribal goddess's motif has an Indo-European origin, because all these peoples were Indo-Europeans. Cernunnos is another well-known figure. The name serves for many examples of probably the same god with antlers. Cernunnos was depicted sitting cross-legged and usually holding a torque, that is to say, a large, rigid or stiff necklace. Cernunnos was venerated intensely across Gaul and Spain, and probably had at least an equivalent in Great Britain and Ireland. But his precise identity or significance in ancient Celtic religion are unknown. It has been supposed that he could have been a god of animals, of nature and fertility. Taranis was the god of the sky and of thunder, and apart from Gaul and Britain and Ireland too, traces of his cult from before the Germanic migration have been found far to the east along the Danube River. In Gaul, he was syncretized, that is to say, merged or associated with Jupiter, the Roman god. And Taranis was referred to by Roman authors as part of a triad of major Gallic gods, the two others being Essus and Tutatis. Tutatis' cult was widespread in Gaul and Britain, and it seems he was a protector god that tribes invoked to defend themselves from foes or disasters. And finally, another goddess worshipped throughout the Celtic world was Epona, the goddess protector of horses and associated with fertility. Contrary to other Celtic gods that stayed local after the Roman invasion and saw their influence diminish, Epona had some success abroad. Her cult spread to other parts of the Roman Empire. She even had a cult in Rome. The lands occupied by the Celts also had one or several healing deities each, often associated with thermal springs. Belenus in northern Italy and Gaul, Borvo in parts of Portugal, Brig or Brigid in Ireland. She was a goddess of fire and light, but in some stories is presented or intervenes to heal warriors. In Great Britain, a lot of wells were dedicated to a goddess that the Romans called Minerva, but that was certainly not how the Celts called her. In the city of Bath, the goddess associated with the thermal spring was called Sulis. This is an example of a local deity. There were hundreds, if not thousands of them, and the cult of Sulis merged with that of Minerva in the Romano-British period. Other gods were associated with the sun, Lugh, the father of Cú Chulainn, in the story we began before, but also in Ireland a goddess called Green, and yet another called Aine, Belenos in Gaul. The truth is that it is very hard, if possible, to understand precisely what deities were associated with across the Celtic world, which was diverse, and probably that no one could have a precise understanding of various pantheons in each region, even at the time. In total, the Celts may have had thousands of gods. For most of them, their names are not even known, and will probably stay forgotten because no one ever wrote them. But we are going to see some of these gods and goddesses intervene in their Irish iteration along the story of Cú Chulainn. So let's resume it. We had left Cú Chulainn as a child, after the prophecy that announced his fate and his first martial exploits. Several years had passed, and Cú Chulainn had become handsome as he turned from child to man. So handsome, actually, that the Ulstermen worried that without a wife of his own, he would probably soon steal their wives and compromise their daughters. So they searched all over Ireland for a suitable wife for him. But he had already set his eyes on Emer, an exquisite young beauty he had fallen in love with. Her beauty was stunning, but so were her gentle voice, her sweet words, and her wisdom. The only problem was that her father was against the match. His older daughter, Emer's sister, was still unmarried, and it would have been improper to marry the younger daughter first. He also argued that Cú Chulainn needed to accomplish deeds worthy of Emer's perfection. In reality, he hoped to gain time. These were only excuses, because his real intentions were to find a better match for his daughter, like the King of Munster. So he declared that before any marriage could be discussed, Cú Chulainn should go train in arms to Scotland. In Scotland, more precisely at Dúnska, the fortress of shadows on the Isle of Skye and its wild mountains plunging into the sea, lived Scarrar, a renowned warrior woman. She was an expert warrior that no man could vanquish, and it was said that few came back alive from Dúnska, from her fortress of shadows on the Isle of Skye. The father of Emer hoped Cú Chulainn would not survive the ordeal and never come back. On the Isle of Skye, Scarrar taught Cú Chulainn the arts of war, and he also made a good friend, Ferdid, who also trained at the Fortress of Shadows. Our hero finally returned from Scotland, fully trained, but again, and this time with no argument left, Emma's father refused to grant her daughter's hand. This was enough. Cú Chulainn, now stronger than ever, stormed the fortress, killing everyone on his path, and fled with Emma to bring her back to Awin Macha. In the following years, Cú Chulainn had more adventures. He rescued a Scandinavian princess, avenged a friend, but when he reached 17, the time for his most famous exploit had come. Táin Bó Cúailnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley. To the southwest of Ulster was a hostile kingdom, Connacht, and on its throne was Maeve, an ambitious and mighty warrior queen. Maeve was a personal enemy and former wife of Cruthur mac Nessa, the king of Ulster, and for some time she had planned to attack Ulster. She coveted in particular a bull called Deirdre Cúailnge, an extraordinary stud that could reproduce fast and was a source of prestige and wealth for his owner. But the bull belonged to Ulster, and she decided to steal it. Cú Chulainn was supposed to watch the frontier, and the simple thought of it made all Ulstermen feel safe. But it happened one day that he neglected his duty to spend the day with a woman. He loved Emer, but it didn't stop him from seducing others. A curse disabled all the men of Ulster suddenly, and Maeve started her invasion plan by sending an army across the frontier. Cú Chulainn realized the price of his negligence and ran to the frontier on a mission to single-handedly stop the army of Connacht. His strength was formidable, but no match for an entire army, and he had to employ ruse. He invoked the right of single combat. 2 champions would fight, one for each side, and the battle would be over when one of the sides would be left without a champion. Being the only warrior for Ulster, Cú Chulainn would have to find the entire army of Maeve, but one by one. He knew he could easily win each fight, at least until he would be exhausted. But the task would be formidable, enormous, as there were thousands on the other side. The men from Connacht followed the rules of honor and couldn't deny the request. And so began the first duels. Cú Chulainn won fight after fight, and days passed that turned into weeks. Queen Maeve saw her army slowly bleed, and the bull still hadn't been stolen. But Cú Chulainn also had to face another dangerous opponent while containing the army of Connacht. One day, between 2 fights, a beautiful young woman came to him and claimed to be the daughter of a king who had come to offer him love. Focused on his task and remembering why he was not on the frontier on the day of the invasion, he refused. Hearing this, the woman revealed herself as the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, who was 1 and 3 at the same time. In revenge for the rejection she had suffered, she intervened in his next fight against yet another warrior from Connacht, and she intervened under 3 different forms, first as an eel, then as a wolf, and finally as a cow. But each time Cú Chulainn wounded her, and she had to retreat. More days passed, and Cú Chulainn's strength was abandoning him. After one particularly arduous combat, he lied, severely wounded, and wondered if he was going to lose, leaving Ulster and its bull at the mercy of his enemies. At this moment, the god Lugh appeared to him and revealed he was his father. He also healed him and encouraged him to triumph. The night passed, and when Cú Chulainn woke up, he realized that during his sleep, the army of Connacht had been attacked. The men of Ulster were still neutralized by the curse, but not the boys, and the boy troop from Awin Macha, of which he once was a member, had attacked the army. The poor boys didn't stand a chance, and had all been slaughtered. Seeing this, he was taken by one of his battle frenzies, the most spectacular yet. He didn't just fight faster and stronger than ever. A metamorphosis took place, and he shifted into a monstrous thing, hideous and shapeless, that attacked the entire army of Connacht at once. He killed hundreds that day. Not enough to vanquish Maeve, but sufficiently to shake her allies. Once he had returned to his human shape, the combats resumed. For 3 days, he had to fight a grueling duel with his best friend, Ferdid, who he had met on the Isle of Skye. But Ferdid fought on the other side, on the side of Connacht. He finally won, but this victory only had the sad taste of his tears. During all these weeks, the curse that paralyzed the men of Ulster had slowly lost its power, and one by one, then in groups, Ulster men were converging towards the battlefield that Cú Chulainn had been controlling for so long. The final battle was near, and again, thanks to the intervention of their hero, Ulster men were victorious. Maeve retreated, and against all odds, Ulster emerged victorious of the Cattle Raid of Cooley. More adventures awaited, and there was still the prophecy that Cú Chulainn would be at the same time forever famous for his deeds, but would die young. But not tonight. On this victory and this day of triumph for Ulster, we will leave our hero to let him rest, and maybe we will return to the rest of his miraculous life and other stories from Irish mythology another time. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want more mythology, I will put links in the description for you to Greek, Egyptian, Norse stories. I'll be back soon for another story, and in the meantime, I'll let you enjoy the sounds of a quiet walk in the green forests and hills of Ireland. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.